This is video 2 for Thursday, March 26th. We're now doing the aftermath of the French and Indian War. During the 7 Years' War, many Americans served in the English army and for the first time came into prolonged contact with English soldiers. The English did not make a good impression, both in how they treated their own soldiers and in how the soldiers behaved themselves. These contacts sowed the first seeds of anti-British sentiment in the colonies, particularly in New England, where much of the fighting took place and where most of the colonial soldiers came from. The English victory spelled trouble for Native Americans, who had previously been able to use French and English disputes to their own advantage. They negotiated their allegiances in return for land, goods, and the right to be left alone. The Native Americans particularly disliked the English, however, because English expansionism was more disruptive to their own way of life. The French had sent few colonists, and many of those colonists were fur trappers who did not settle anywhere permanently. In the aftermath of the war, the English raised the price of goods sold to Native Americans, and had a monopoly after all, and ceased paying rent on the western forts. In response, Ottawa war chief Pontiac rallied a group of tribes in the Ohio Valley and attacked colonial outposts. The attack and resultant wars were called the Pontiac's Rebellion. In response to the initial attacks, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763 forbidding settlement west of the rivers running through the Appalachians. The proclamation came too late. Settlers had already moved west of the line. The proclamation did have one effect. However, it agitated colonial settlers who regarded it as unwarranted British interference in colonial affairs. Pontiac's Rebellion was in part a response to the colonists expanding into the Ohio River Valley and encroaching on the Native Americans' lands. Recall similar events such as the Pequot War and Bacon's Rebellion. The British were forced to quell this rebellion at great cost, in addition to the cost of fighting the French. They used germ warfare in the form of smallpox-infected blankets to help defeat the Ottawa. The resulting Proclamation of 1763 is significant for a number of reasons. 1763 is often viewed as a turning point in British colonial relations that marks the end of solitary neglect. The Proclamation of 1763 may be viewed as the first in a new series of restrictions imposed on the colonists by the British Parliament, and in that way it marks the first step towards revolution. Furthermore, it established a pattern of demarcating Indian territory, a pattern that would be adopted and pursued by the United States government long after the colonists gained independence. So that's going to be us going now into the road to revolution. So just be aware of the fact that essentially because of the French and Indian War, this is what sparked all the rebellious natures, because of taxations that came out of it, because of the increased presence of soldiers now, because the British government felt like they couldn't take care of themselves, so on and so on. So now we're going on the Sugar Act, Currency Act, and Stamp Act. One result of the 7 Years' War was that in financing the war, the British government had run up a huge debt. The new king, George III, and his prime minister, George Grenville, felt that the colonists should help pay the debt. After all, the reason the colonies had been beneficiaries of the war. Furthermore, their tax burden was relatively light compared to the taxpayers in England, even on the same goods. Meanwhile, the colonists felt that they had been provided so many soldiers that they had fulfilled their obligations. Accordingly, Parliament imposed new regulations and taxes on the colonists. The first was the Sugar Act of 1763, which was the import tax, which established a number of new duties and which also contained provisions aimed at deterring molasses smugglers. Although Parliament had previously passed over other acts aimed at controlling colonial trade and manufacturing, there was little colonial resistance prior to the decade leading to the Revolutionary War. There were benefits to being part of the vast British Empire, and most Americans accepted regulations of trade such as the Navigation Acts as part of mercantilism. Furthermore, although laws such as the Molasses Act of 1733 were on the books, smuggling was common practice and little revenue from taxes was actually collected. Some historians have gone so far as to suggest that Parliament never intended the Molasses Act to raise revenue, but merely to function as a protective tariff against the French imports. Parliament was quite shrewd in passing the Sugar Act of 1764, in that this new act actually lowered the duty on molasses coming into the colonies from the West Indies. What angered the colonists the most was that the new regulations was to be more strictly enforced. Duties were to be collected, which hadn't been before. It became more difficult for colonial shippers to avoid committing even minor violations with the Sugar Act. Furthermore, violators were to be arrested and tried in a Vice Admiralty court, courts in which a single judge issued a verdict without the deliberation of a jury. It was this last provision of the Sugar Act that suggested to some colonists that Parliament was overstepping its authority and violating their rights as Englishmen. Another parliamentary act, the Currency Act, forbade the colonies to issue paper money. Collectively, the Sugar Act, Currency Act, and Proclamation of 1763 caused a great deal of discontent in the colonies, whose residents bristled at what they correctly viewed as British attempts to exert greater control. These acts signaled a clear end to British long-standing policy of salutary neglect. That these acts came during a post-war economic depression further aggravated the situation. Colonial protests to these acts, however, were uncoordinated and ineffective. That all changed when the Parliament passed the Stamp Act the following year in 1765. The Stamp Act included a number of provocative elements. First, it was a tax specifically aimed at raising revenue, thus awakening the colonists to the likelihood that even more taxes could follow. The Stamp Act demonstrated that the colony's tradition of self-taxation was surely being unjustly taken by Parliament, much to the dismay of many colonists. Second, it was the broad-based tax covering of all legal documents and licenses. Not only did it affect almost everyone, but it particularly affected a group that was literate, persuasive, and argumentative, namely lawyers. Third, it was a tax on goods produced within the colonies. Reaction to the Stamp Act built on previous grievances and consequently was more forceful than any protest preceding it. A pamphlet by James Otis called The Rights of the British Colonies asserted and laid out the colonists' argument against the taxes and became a bestseller of its day. Otis put forward the no taxation without representation argument that later became the rallying of the Revolution. Because the colonists did not elect members of the Parliament, he argued they were not obligated to pay taxes. Otis did not advocate secession. Rather, he argued for either representation in Parliament or a greater degree of self-governing for the colonial delegation in Parliament. The British scoffed at the notion, arguing that the colonists were already represented in Parliament. Their argument was rooted in the theory of virtual representation, which stated that members of Parliament represented all British subjects regardless of who elected them. The colonists, for their part, knew that the representation would be too small to protect their interests, and so never pushed this issue. What they wanted, and what the British were refusing to give them, was a right to determine their own taxes. So let's finish up, and we'll finish before the Townshend Acts. Opponents of the Stamp Act united in the various colonies. In Virginia, Patrick Henry drafted the Virginia Stamp Act resolves, protesting the tax, asserting the colonists' right to a large measure of self-government. The Virginia legislature removed Henry's most radical propositions before passing the resolves. In Boston, mobs burned the customs officers in effigy, meaning like they're fake models of them, tore down a customs house and nearly destroyed the governor's mansion. Protest groups formed throughout the colonies, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, led by Sam Adams. The opposition was so effective that by the time the law was supposed to take effect, not one of the Crown's appointed duty collectors was willing to perform his job. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act with the Declaratory Act. Just as important, George III replaced Prime Minister Grenville, whom the colonists now loathed, with Lord Rockingham, who had opposed the Stamp Act. Rockingham oversaw the repeal, but also linked it to the passage of the Declaratory Act, which asserted the British government's right to tax and legislate in all cases anywhere in the colonies. Thus, although the colonies had won the battle over the Stamp Act, they had not yet gained any ground in the war of principles over Parliament's power in the colonies. And that will end the review of the document. Now we're going to look at the key concepts, wrapping up from, we got most of the key concepts from the Unit 2. Let's see, I think that's kind of slave stuff yesterday. Colonization. Things like English colonization efforts attracted a comparatively large number of male and female British migrants, as well as other European migrants, all of whom sought social mobility, economic prosperity, religious freedom, improving living conditions. These colonists focused on agriculture and settled on land taken from Native Americans, from whom they lived separately. Don't forget about the different regions. The Chesapeake and North Carolina regions grew prosperous, exporting tobacco, a labor-intensive product initially cultivated by white, mostly male indentured servants. New England colonies, initially settled by Puritans, developed around small towns with family farms and achieved a thriving mix of economy and agriculture, mostly because of their climate and bad rocky soil. The middle colonies supported a flourishing export economy based on cereal crops and attracted a broad range of European migrants, called the bread colonies, leading to societies with greater cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity and tolerance. The colonies of the southern Atlantic coast and the British West Indies used long growing seasons to develop plantation economies based on exporting staple crops like tobacco, indigo, not cotton yet, They depended on the labor of enslaved Africans who often constitute the majority of populations in these areas and developed their own forms of cultural and religious autonomy. Distance and Britain's initial lax attention led to the colonies creating self-governing institutions that were unusually democratic for the era. New England colonies based power in participatory town meetings, which in turn elected members to their colonial legislatures. In the southern colonies, elite planters exercised local authority and also dominated the elected assemblies. Got the trade yesterday. Yeah, we saw that. American Indian resistance to Spanish colonizing efforts in the North America, particularly after the Pueblo Revolt, led to Spanish accommodation of some aspects of the American Indian culture in the Southwest. Unlike the English, never made those accommodations. That's something we didn't cover in the readings. All the British colonies participated in varying degrees of Atlantic slave trade. We talked about that yesterday. As chattel slavery became the dominant labor system in many southern colonies, new laws created a strict racial system that prohibited interracial relationships and defined the descendants of African Americans' mothers as black and enslaved in perpetuity. Africans developed both overt and covert means to resist the dehumanizing nature of slavery. We talked about that already. The presence of different European religious and ethnic groups contributed to a significant degree of pluralism, initially the exchange, which were later enhanced by the First Great Awakening and the spread of European Enlightenment ideas. The British colonies experienced a gradual Anglicanization over time, developing autonomous political communities based on English models, meaning like not all of them were really English, but over time, by the 1750s or so, most of the colonies are very dominantly English. Based on English models with influence from intercolonial commercial ties, the emergence of a transatlantic print culture, and the spread of Protestant evangelicalism. The goals and interests of the European leaders and colonists at times diverged, leading to the growing mistrust on both sides of the Atlantic. Colonists, especially in the British North America, expressed dissatisfaction over issues including territorial settlements, frontier defense, and self-rule and trade. Colonial resistance to imperial control drew on local experiences of self-government, evolving ideas of liberty, the political thought of enlightenment, greater religious independence and diversity, and an ideology critical of perceived corruption in the imperial system. Okay, so that's all the key concepts from Unit 2. Unit 3 covers everything through like Washington Adams. For time's sake, I'll just read the key concepts that I covered tonight from like the Stamp Act and the French Indian War tomorrow on Friday's videos. So we'll stop there. Y'all have a good night, and we'll see you tomorrow.